Welcome. My name is Martha Swan. I'm the director of John Brown Lives, which is a freedom education and human rights project. I'm delighted to be surrounded by, well, sort of surrounded by such marvelous women and scholars and researchers tonight for this discussion. I want to thank Melanie Redding, who is John Brown Lives Communications and Development Director, for pulling all this together, the technology to make it possible for this conversation tonight. Um, I think it was Sandra Weber, one of our panelists tonight, who brought to my attention some time ago that 2021 marks the 125th anniversary of the John Brown Farm, the home of Mary and John Brown, being acquired by New York State in perpetuity. And this is really a fact, an anniversary, which we felt merited being recognized and heralded, that there are stories and histories for us to learn from. And it's also an opportunity here in 2021 to project forward if we dare be as bold and as visionary and as inspired as our forebears, who 125 years ago, and longer than that actually, but 125 years ago, if taking this anniversary, who set aside this site for the use of the public in perpetuity. So I'm very happy that we have this occasion and such fine people to be with us tonight. An anniversary like of this nature is an occasion for retrospection. It's an occasion for commemoration. It's also an opportunity to see where we are right now in our current crisis in our country. It's an opportunity to project the farm into the future. And as the Friends group of the John Brown Farm, we see ourselves as the inheritors of the many far-sighted individuals whose care, vision, advocacy have protected and preserved this site for more than a century. We cannot help but ask ourselves what we can and must do now to ensure that the John Brown Farm will be of use to all New Yorkers and freedom-loving people around the world for generations to come. You can, so about that, I think you saw in the notes from Melanie that the public, please put your questions in the Q&A, which will be, there'll be time at the end of the panel discussion to answer those. So I'm going to sign off by thanking you again and by introducing Lavada Nahan, who is the an interpreter of African American history for the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. She'll be your moderator tonight. Enjoy, and we'll see you on the other side.
Thank you, Martha, and welcome everyone. On behalf of New York State Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to be part of this wonderful conversation as we look into the history of the John Brown Farm, the home of John and Mary Brown, and the people that they were related to, both family and socially, and also why does it matter today? We're going to start this panel off this evening hearing from Dr. Margaret Washington. She is a professor of American Studies at Cornell University, and she will share her thoughts on John Brown Farm, John Brown himself, his relationship with other abolitionists, and discuss several paintings about Brown and how they speak to the intersectionality of race, gender, and memory. It is my pleasure now to turn it over to Dr. Washington.
Thanks, Lavada, and thank everyone for tuning in this evening. First, I want to say that greetings from Ithaca and Cornell University, and to remind you that Cornell is located on the traditional homelands of the Cayuga Nation, members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. After John Brown's death an unsubstantiated story appeared in the Anglo-African magazine that a Black woman got close enough to Old Brown on his way to his execution to hold up her baby and ask him to kiss the child, which he did. That apparently was not true, but the story got around. In 1882, an Irish-born abolitionist painter named Thomas Hovenden was asked to recreate that scene. And he created the last moments of John Brown, with Brown being led out of the courthouse to the gallows, and a Black woman with a baby leaning the baby over for him to kiss. In 1941, African-American artist Jacob Lawrence painted a series of 22 gripping scenes depicting the life of John Brown. And Lawrence, by the way, would do the same kind of series for Harriet Tubman. And then in 1942, African-American artist Horace Pippin painted both the trial of John Brown and John Brown going to hanging. That's his most famous one. And John Brown going to hanging is a painting of a crowd of approving whites who are gathered around while John Brown is being led to his hanging. And there is a Black woman standing in the background away from the crowd with her back turned from them, scowling disapprovingly at the white spectators. Reportedly, Horace Pippin's grandmother was at John Brown's hanging. Pippin was born, I believe, in 1888. These artistic depictions remind us that John Brown, as a social justice martyr, has been memorialized by Blacks and whites since the generation after his passing. I want to emphasize a little bit his significance for African-American women who were deeply involved in the struggle to end slavery in the South and to gain civil rights in the North. Brown was a regular visitor at the home of Frederick and Anna Douglass in Rochester, New York. He was a welcome visitor. He wrote his provisional constitution while he was holed up in Rochester, often interacting only with Anna and the Douglas's youngest daughter, Annie, because Frederick was often away giving speeches and during the day taking care of his newspapers. His letters, that is to say, Brown's letters from the Douglass home, suggest a warm relationship between the two households, that is the Brown and the Douglass households. But John Brown also spent many hours in Syracuse, New York, at the home of Jermaine and Caroline Logan. And we don't hear much about the Logans. Jermaine had fled from bondage. He was on the run. And he was actually, even though he was an AME Zion minister in Syracuse, he would go back and forth to Canada. And at one point, almost decided to stay because he was basically, by American law, a fugitive. But he decided that he would stay in Syracuse and fight slave catchers. My wife and I unite, he wrote to John Brown, in urging your return as soon as possible. That was in 1858. Caroline, his wife, was considered one of the boldest conductors in the Syracuse area. She had at one point got into a fight over a gun with a slave catcher. So she was a very upfront woman. The Douglas's son, Lewis, and one of the Logan's daughters would later marry. Jermaine Logan was the person who introduced John Brown to Harriet Tubman. Jermaine Logan was the person who helped arrange the massive convention of colored citizens in Chatham, Ontario, where Brown laid out his plans for Harper's Ferry, although he didn't specify that. In Chatham, John Brown also met the provincial Freeman editor, Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Both Shadd Cary's husband and her brothers attended the convention. And Elizabeth Gloucester of Brooklyn and her husband Stephen were staunch supporters and funders of John Brown. Elizabeth was a businesswoman in her own right, and she had her own money, and she supported John Brown on her own accord. And as a matter of fact, when Frederick Douglass had his last meeting with John Brown, at Chambersburg just before Harper's Ferry, and they said their goodbyes, he gave him money and a letter from Elizabeth Gouster. So, and I could go on, but time will not allow it. But the one question is why? Why were these Black women revolutionaries, activists, so taken with John Brown? Well, for one thing, consider respectability. John Brown treated Black women like ladies. They were misses. There was full equality. There was sitting around the table for everyone if you were in the Brown home. So he made no distinctions between women of African-American women and white women. And that was not the case with a lot of abolitionists. So John Brown was an egalitarian. He gave them the respect that they felt they deserved. There was the issue of faith. John Brown was a man of faith. Many of these women were very, very strong in faith. They followed what was called perfectionism, which I don't have time to get into, but it was a millennial concept to create a more perfect world and to get rid of all inhumanity and all evil. And the worst evil of all was slavery. So faith united them. And then John Brown had a sense of equality when it came to women. He sought out Harriet Tubman at the suggestion of Jermaine Logan, and he wrote back to his son, he is the most of a man I ever met. The first I see is General Tubman. The second I see is General Tubman. Unfortunately for Brown, but fortunately for Harriet, she was not with him at Harper's Ferry. The other point that one could draw in terms of his attitude toward women was when the League of Gileadites was formed in 1850, when the Brown family were living in Springfield. And this was a league that was basically a protectionist league for abolitionists who came to the city of Springfield, and also for any slave catcher who came and tried to take someone back to bondage. And John Brown had organized this league, and it was a league that had both males and females in it, even though it was a militant, get your gun organization. The other thing about John Brown that attracted women was he hated bigotry. He wouldn't tolerate it. And as I said, many abolitionists who opposed slavery were not necessarily egalitarians when it came to challenging the racism that surrounded them in the North. John Brown saw African Americans, he saw their humanity, and that was what was most important to him. And this is something that women, as the bearers of culture and the bearers of children, picked up on immediately. And the best example of that, there are many, but the best one that I can give, and I'll end with this, is what he did when he went to Missouri, took 11 so-called fugitives from slavery because they were about to be sold and separated as families, and marched them all the way from Missouri to Windsor, Canada, or to Detroit, where they could take the boat to Windsor, Canada. And the idea was to show, first of all, what the power of anti-slavery could do. And women were very, very impressed about that. It was, when you read the letters that women write to each other, they're talking about this or they're writing about it, that he marched 11 people, 82 days over Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, and Michigan to freedom. And by the way, one child was born on the way, and I don't have to tell you, it was a son. I don't have to tell you what his name was. So the humanity of this man was something that impressed African-American women. His politics, of course, but John Brown was humanity itself. And let me end with a letter that Frances Ellen Watkins, who was an African-American abolitionist poet, wrote to Mary Brown after John Brown was captured. In an hour like this, the common words of sympathy may seem like idle words, and yet I want to say something to you, the noble wife of the hero of the 19th century. Belonging to the race your dear husband reached forth his hand to assist, I thank you for the brave words you have spoken. A republic that produces such a wife and mother may hope for better days. Not in vain has your dear husband periled all. From the prison comes forth a shout of triumph over that power whose ethics are robbery of the feeble and oppression of the weak. The trophies of those chivalry are a plundered cradle and a scourged and bleeding woman. Enclosed, I send you a few dollars as a token of my gratitude, reverence, and love. Yours respectfully, Frances Ellen Watkins. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I would just like to remind all of our guests this evening, if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A function, and we look forward to asking them when all of our presenters have completed their talks. Next, I would like to turn to Alice Keesey Mecoy. She is the great-great-great-granddaughter of John and Mary Brown. And this evening, she will share with us her thoughts on the Browns and the complex relationship they had with the farm. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you. Wow, following that, thank you, Margaret. That was wonderful. John Brown fathered 20 children, 7 with his first wife, Diana, who died in childbirth, and 13 with his second wife, Mary. Mary was a plain, hardworking, loyal woman who spent most of the last 10 years of her marriage away from her husband. John was always traveling around the country fighting slavery, while Mary was raising a large family, growing food, shearing sheep, spinning yarn, weaving cloth, and trying hard to make ends meet. In 1849, 1 month after the death of their 11-year-old daughter, Ellen, Mary packed up the family and they moved from Springfield, Massachusetts to a rental farm in North Elba. John, Mary, and 6 children moved to the small rural town of North Elba, New York. John was so sure that he and his family would live out their lives in North Elba, living beside and assisting the Blacks that were receiving free parcels of land from Gerrit Smith, that he arranged to have the body of little Ellen brought to North Elba Cemetery so she could be near the family. He purchased 244 acres from Gerrit Smith for his family to live and work. After settling his family in the rental farm, John returned to Springfield to continue working on his wool business. In August, he left for England to try to sell his wool. I lost my page. Sorry. I'm missing a page. Mary and the children were left in North Elba to work the farm and make the life. And they did. 3 of his children went on to marry local people from North Elba, and Annie, my great-great-grandmother, met her great love, Dauphine Thompson, brother of Henry, who actually married her sister Ruth, in North Elba. Unfortunately, he died during Harper's Ferry raid. But Mary was alone so much of this time. She supported her husband in his business endeavors and also in his war on slavery, but North Elba was very far away from family and friends, and she was lonely. 1850 saw John closing down the wool business, but he did not return to North Elba until his daughter Ruth's wedding to a local boy, Henry Thompson. The Browns, led by Mary, remained in North Elba at the rental home. John came to North Elba as often as he could, but he was attending court. He was being sued by many of the wool sellers, and he was trying to close down the business that he and a friend had started. In early 1852, John moved his family out of the rental farm in North Elba and back to Akron. They couldn't afford to pay rent on the farm, build a house on their land, and supply a place for John to live while he was taking care of the business. At the time of this move, Mary was pregnant with her 12th child. The unnamed baby boy was born in April of 1852 and lived for 1 month. He was buried in Akron. While in Akron, Mary gave birth to her 13th and last child, Ellen, in September of 1854, and that winter, with an infant, John again moved his family back to North Elba. Their son-in-law, Henry, had built the 4-bedroom unplastered house known as the John Brown Farm. The next year was 1855, and John left to join his sons and his son-in-law in Kansas to help that state enter the Union as a free, no-slave state, again, leaving Mary to run the farm with 2 young daughters, a toddler, and a 21-year-old son, Watson. After the Kansas events were over, John continued to travel around the country, raising money for his crusade of ending slavery and prepping for his big event, which we now call the Harper's Ferry Affair. Mary and the younger children remained at North Elba, again, raising livestock, farming mostly for personal consumption, interacting with neighbors and friends, but still often alone. From 1849, when they first moved to North Elba, until his death in 1859, John was away from the farm more than he was there. His youngest child, Ellen, was 5 when he died, and she admitted later in life that she barely knew him. After his death in 1859, Brown supporters helped the family with monetary donations and the education of Annie and Sarah, but it was a difficult time for the family. Money was scarce, and while Anna and Sarah were at school, only Mary and Ellen were left to run the farm. 1862, just 3 years after John's death, Mary decided to leave New York and move to California. She'd heard about it from relatives, how the temperate weather, good land, friendly people would do her good. And so first she leased the farm in North Elba and then agreed to sell it a year or 2 later. She sold all but 1/4 acre where the boulder and the grave are located. It was to remain accessible to Mary and her heirs into perpetuity. Mary lived to be 67 years old. She outlived 9 of her 13 children and 1 of her 5 stepchildren. She returned once to North Elba 2 years before her death. She returned in 1882 to witness the burial of her son, Watson, who had died during the Harper's Ferry Affair and whose skeleton had been used as a doctor's office display. Watson was buried next to his father near the big boulder. Life in North Elba was hard, cold, and isolating for Mary and the children, yet there were also happy times. Annie describes in detail hikes taken by her siblings, and friends that revealed the beauty and wonder of the area. Love grew, families were started, friendships were forged. While it was often lonely, but it was also a warm and happy home made so by Mary Brown, my great-great-great-grandmother.
Thank you for those wonderful memories, Alice. Again, if you have any questions, we do ask that you please put them in the Q&A feature and not in the chat. It is my pleasure now to introduce Sandra Weber. Sandra is an author and lecturer, and will focus on Kate Fields, the woman who saved John Brown's farm, and also share with us the fun she's having in this wormhole of research around the book she's developing around Ms. Fields and the Browns. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you, Hovenden. So we are celebrating the 125 years of New York State owning the farm, but I wanted today to go back a little further to find out how it was that the farm was there and who owned it and donated it to New York State. And that will be the story of the spearhead of that effort is Kate Field. And Alice set me right up for this, wonderful Alice. So the Brown family left to go to California in 1863. And Alexis Hinckley, who was the brother of the wife of one of the other sons, stayed and took over the farm for a while and eventually bought it. But then his wife died and he really didn't want to live there anymore because it held sad memories for him. So he decided to put it up for sale. And in 1869, along came Kate Field. Now, at that time, she was about 30 years old and living in Boston. Now, she had not ever known John Brown in person, but she had been a supporter of John Brown. And she was living in Boston when she was in her late teens and living with her rich aunt and uncle. And she expressed her support for John Brown and abolition, and her uncle withheld her allowance and disavowed her inheritance because she would not disavow John Brown. So Kate Field set out on her own, and she would remain a single woman her whole life, a single professional woman in the 1870s and 80s and 90s. She would be an actress, a journalist, a lecturer. She would travel to Europe and later to Washington, D.C. She would write for the New York Tribune, and later she would start her own newspaper, Kate Field's Washington. And most people don't know anything about the association of Kate Field with John Brown. For most people, she is of the social literary circle at the time, but she saved the John Brown farm, and she also is responsible for saving the John Brown Fort, which is in Harper's Ferry. So Kate Field arrived at the farm and was astonished that it was for sale with the bones of John Brown laying there. So the price was $2,000 and she wanted to buy the farm. So she proposed to a group of Boston abolitionists that they each pitch in $100, and if 20 of them could do that, then they would have the $2,000 to buy the farm. But she only found one supporter in Boston. That was a woman, Mrs. Waterston. But she turned to some friends in New York City, and within 15 minutes, they were able to get enough supporters to sign up, and they bought the farm on January 10th, 1870. Now, Kate Field had great hopes for what the John Brown farm could be. She wanted it to be held as sacred ground and as historic ground. And one of the things she said was it would prove that even in the 19th century, there is such a thing as poetic justice. So she was one of the few people who at the time realized this was important history. And I love this concept of poetic justice. It comes up throughout John Brown's life. Poetic justice being kind of the idea that John Brown was hung as a felon, but it's kind of ironic that he then became recognized as a hero and martyr, especially after the Civil War. So Kate Field saw that the farm was of national interest. Now, she also had a position regarding forest preservation. And she was foremost in the Adirondack region in promoting forest preservation, stopping logging, which would prevent the water supply from being washed away and going down to the cities. And she strongly believed that a great Adirondack park should be created. And what's interesting is that she added one more detail to that vision. She wanted the John Brown farm to be the center and the nucleus of that great Adirondack park. So there's something for us to work toward. So she saw immediately this connection in the Adirondacks of that nature and social history need to work together or in side by side in the Adirondacks. Now, it took a while for the park to be created. 1885, the Adirondack Forest Preserve was created. 1892, the park's delineated with the blue line. And so finally, Kate Field sees in 1892 that a lot of the land around the farm is now being owned by the state. It's forest preserve. And she sees that some of the donors are passing away, they're getting elderly, and it's time for the farm to be preserved and properly administered in perpetuity. So she decides that the best place, the best steward for the farm would be New York State. And so they begin talking with New York State about the property, and they work out an agreement with the stipulation that the John Brown Farm would continue to be dedicated and used for the purposes of a public park or reservation forever. They were really looking to the future and really making sure that this property was going to be cared for. And that was signed into law on March 27th, 1896. So officially, New York State became the owner of the John Brown Farm. However, they were pretty wise and they decided, we're not going to go have a celebration in March. We're going to wait until July. And so they waited until July 21st to hold the big celebration of the state ownership. Unfortunately, by the time July 21st came along, Kate Field had passed away. Quite unexpectedly, she died of pneumonia in Hawaii on May 19th, 2 months before the unveiling of the monument and the turning over of the farm. But that day, July 21st, 1896, was quite a momentous occasion. It was not only the formal transfer of the farm. As I said, the donors created a large monument that listed the donors' names on it. That was really the first man-made monument that was erected at the farm. The monument was unveiled by the Thompsons brothers, their two younger brothers had died at Harper's Ferry. And so they unveiled the monument and the crowd sang America. And the monument was the speech given by the Civil War veteran representing the donors said this monument is presented to be kept in perpetuity in remembrance of Kate Field and her associates who bought and kept intact the farm and who have presented it to New York State. Also that day, July 21st, they erected a flagpole, and for the first time, an American flag flew over the grave of John Brown. And in raising that flag, Colonel Lyman said, "It will become a guiding beacon to the patriotic pilgrims who seek this shrine, as well as a certification to the world that here lived and here lies Osawatomie Brown." It was also the last year that Lyman Epps Jr. was there at the farm celebration. He was 82 years old, and he and his children sang "Blow Ye the Trumpets Blow." And at the end of the program, a platoon of veterans from a Grand Army post fired 3 volleys over John Brown's grave. This is the customary salute of a soldier's funeral. Thus, Captain John Brown received military honors 37 years after his execution. A military salute, a United States flag, a monument, guardianship of the homestead by state authorities. This indeed was poetic justice. And I just want to conclude with what I think is Kate Field's most powerful statement and most thought-provoking statement. She presented a lecture about the Adirondacks all over Boston, Chicago, everywhere she went, and talked about her time in the Adirondacks. And she talked about her adventure. She made it very humorous. It was very entertainment. But she decided that at the end of this lecture, she wanted to make people think. And so she ended it with a tribute to John Brown. And near the very end of that tribute to John Brown, she says, "The moral of the Adirondacks is freedom." I'd like to just leave you with that, thinking of that thought. The moral of the Adirondacks is freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra, and that's a very powerful ending. But it will step us in nicely to our Q&A. And so I'm going to ask, please, if all the panelists will turn on your cameras. And our first question Frederick Douglass was a strong supporter of women's suffrage. Did John Brown have a public position on this? What about Mary and the children? Was it an important issue for them? So who would like to step into answering that great question?
Well-
If you will, you're muted, Margaret.
I was going to ask you, Levada, would you repeat the question? I was fooling with my video. Sorry.
Frederick Douglass was a strong supporter of women's suffrage. Did John Brown have a public opinion on this?
I can jump in a little bit, and I'm sure Margaret has some more to say about this. I know that there are statements where John Brown talked about supporting universal suffrage for everyone. As far as any detailed statements that he made about it, I don't think he made many public statements about it. And I also know that, like with Annie and the children, he, you know, the boys did the dishes, and the girl, you know, there wasn't, the chores were split equally. And I know one time he made a joke of something about, you know, that Annie's smarter than you are to one of the boys or something. So he seemed to certainly live with equality for women, but it was not, as far as I know, you know, what I found, a public position that he really put out there strongly.
I concur.
Well, I'll concur with that. I don't recall any position that he took. He was one of the founding members of the Radical Abolitionist Party. So was Frederick Douglass. So was Gerrit Smith, and they all supported suffrage. That party. And then the other thing is that when after Potawatomi, when he was on the run, when he was a fugitive from the government, he was hidden by the Ashtabula Female Anti-Slavery Society in Ashtabula County, Ohio. That was the most radical feminist suffragist organization in the state. They were behind the Akron convention where Sojourner Truth spoke. They were very radical. As a matter of fact, John Jr. married one of the officers of the Ashtabula Female Anti-Slavery Society, and they were rabid suffragists. So without knowing whether he publicly went to one of the women's conventions and stated that, I couldn't say, but I think his actions indicate that he certainly would have supported universal suffrage.
And the other part of that question about Mary and the children, I don't believe, and Alice, you may know more, I don't think any of the children or Mary really talked much about women's suffrage.
Annie did a little bit in the 1900s when she was in California, but she was more wanting women to have rights because she saw women getting beat by their husbands and being property of their husbands. It wasn't necessarily directed towards the vote. It was directed towards being a human being.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And was it Sarah that one of them was very involved in the Chinese immigrant effort?
Sarah.
Yeah.
She learned the language so she could teach them English.
That speaks a lot. It's not an easy language to learn.
Don't know how well you do not know how great she was at it, but she learned it so she could teach them English.
But that speaks to commitment.
Uh-huh.
That speaks to, you know, carrying on her father's mission of seeing all humans, seeing the humanity in everyone. So
Yes.
that is a great legacy to move forward with. So thank you. So our next question, ladies, are there other John Brown descendants who are actively involved with the farm?
I don't believe so. I participated in some brainstorming at the farm, and Sandra and Margaret were there with me, and I worked with John Brown Lives, but a lot of descendants don't make it known that they're descendants.
But there were descendants who were involved, when do I want to say, like back in the early 1900s, right?
Oh, yeah.
You know, through the years, a lot of the granddaughters and great granddaughters were involved, like especially in having the women's tablets placed at the farm in 1946. And it's great to
Yeah.
see that women were recognized at the farm.
So a couple of additional questions, and I'm going to aim this one to Margaret, if I may. You shared a lot around this history, and I know with your work, you continue to share a lot around American studies. We really want to target why is John Brown's memory and Mary Brown's work and memory important for us today?
I think it's important because John Brown was a Democrat with a small d. And he believed in, so obviously everybody should be represented. And in terms of his concept of what was the way we should be governed politically, he believed in representation, a representative government, a Republican form of government. I think there's another reason too, because I think we're supposed to be a democracy. That's what we're working toward, this more perfect union, which is what a democracy should be. We haven't gotten there yet, but that is our aim. In addition to that, John Brown was an anti-racist. And that's really important for someone who's an activist at that particular moment, because there were people, as I mentioned in my early remarks, there were people who were opposed to slavery but didn't like Black people. And so you could be an abolitionist, as one abolitionist said, when the abolitionist movement tried to set a policy whereby, because of the racism within the movement, that you made a special effort to befriend someone Black. And one particular abolitionist said, well, the darker the night, the better abolitionist I am, because if I walk with a Black person at night, nobody can see me. So there were problems within the anti-slavery movement. John Brown didn't have those kind of hangups. And as I was trying to show in my paper, he understood that the welfare of African Americans was paramount, because slavery, more than anything else, was about separating families, destroying the connectedness, the humanity of people. When you take away a woman's children, when you take away a husband and sell them, 2,500 miles away. So that was seeing them as people. And I think that's really the key to being an anti-racist is, there is no such thing as white supremacy. And that's what John Brown acted on.
That's one of the things that I find very interesting, even today, when everyone speaks about abolitionists. Very few realize the strength of the colonization movement that was hand in hand.
Right.
That is something that we as a people really don't talk about. And even we don't discuss Abraham Lincoln also started out as a colonization supporter, wanting to send all of the soon to be freed enslaved to South America. So there's all these layers that we often don't discuss. So I thank you for pointing those out. So a question for you, Alice. We have someone here who is in the process of researching their family history because they feel they may be a descendant.
Okay.
So how can they get in touch with you?
I have a website called John Brown Kin, K-I-N, and you can contact me through there. And I get about 15 of these requests a month. I'm happy to help out and let you see if you're in my immense database of descendants. So that's how they can get hold of me.
And another says, a descendant of the Brewster family does some volunteer work there. The Brewster family is connected to the Brown family?
Yes, Martha Brewster married Oliver, who died at Harper's Ferry. I wasn't aware of that, but that's entirely possible. I've never met them, but I don't live in New York, so I don't get to go to the farm as often as I like to. That's great if there is.
Please make yourself known. We would like to know that. So this is not a question, but it comes from Ms. Trace. Brown and his abolitionist team, she believes, thought that politically it was unwise to get the suffrage issue on their platform. Garrison in Boston and his group of abolitionists, and on the other hand, thought that women's suffrage should be part of the movement. There was a political disagreement between these abolitionists, which might have been why they don't hear much about Brown and the suffrage issue. There's a lot around suffrage. Very few people realize that, we're so focused on the women's suffrage movement, but in fact that it was in fact universal suffrage. For that was the point, to give equal rights and votes to everyone. And as we went towards a 15th Amendment, that became an issue, that some choices were going to have to be made. And that became politically astute, that it was either going to be the right of men of African descent to vote or women to vote. And this also recently came up as we were celebrating the 19th Amendment, because it is in that separation that we see a high level of racial racism, honestly, coming out of Stanton, that a lot of people don't acknowledge, that there was, it was not always smooth sailing when it came to suffrage. And it was a very divisive subject on many levels. And I know one of the things that I learned, and I thank you for that, Margaret, about that, the new statuary that's in Central Park with Sojourner Truth and Stanton and Anthony on it, that that was not always smooth sailing. So there's much around suffrage that we do have to look at. So I have, there's a lot to know about Kate Fields, and in learning about her through your work, Sandra, is there anything else that you would like to share with us about her legacy?
Oh, I portray Kate Field many times. I've written about her, and she's really quite hysterical. She went on into the Adirondacks with Reverend William Henry Harrison Murray. The Murray's Full. Murray wrote the ultimate guidebook of people coming to the Adirondacks. And when people heard that she was going into the woods with there would be 4 women going into the woods, they looked at them and they said, oh, 4 women, order 4 coffins and take them with you.
Oh, wow.
And she's hysterical. It goes on and on. Yes. And talking about like the crossover of suffrage, I'll bring her into that. Like, for example, she, although, she supported abolition and anti-slavery and was a friend to Blacks, she did not support the suffrage movement until 1893, when she went to the World's Fair in Chicago, and Susan B. Anthony was there. And for the first time, she publicly decided that she would support women's suffrage. So yeah, it's the two issues are very interrelated. Actually, my last book was on women's suffrage. So this interrelationship of these two issues and the overlap of the players, as you well know, Margaret, the overlap of the players here in the abolition movement and the suffrage movement is fascinating.
So we have another question. Was it unusual for Mary to run the farm mostly alone? And why was she, or how was she able to do this? What was her family background that gave her the skills to be able to run a farm?
Good question.
Very resourceful person. She had help from her children. And as we talked about earlier, John Brown made sure that all his boys learned girl skills and all his girls learned boy skills. But they also didn't have a profitable farm. They farmed for themselves.
Right.
What they needed for their animals, what they needed for feeding themselves. They were not a commercial farm.
Right.
And I'm sure it was a lot of trial and error and asking John what to do.
Well, John sent a lot of advice without having to be asked, right?
Yes, he did.
Can't defend this, don't put down too much hay for the hogs, and yeah, he always had advice for them. But I also want to put in a plug for Mary because, well, Mary was born in Granville, New York, right outside the Adirondacks. So, hey, she had it in her blood.
Yeah.
Excellent. So what is John Brown's relationship with Timbuktu, the people of African descent community?
He was a part of it. He moved up there to be a part of it. They were the people that received the parcels of land.
So he went in support. Did the mainstream press cover the saving and then the state acquisition of the farm?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Oh yeah, it was big news.
Mm-hmm.
It was big news. Yeah, I was like, oh yeah.
As a matter of fact, the state acquisition, I think, was one of the best documented events, probably of the farm. Albert Shaw, the journalist and editor, wrote a huge article about it for, what was it, The Nation? No, Review of Reviews. And Catherine McClellan, a woman photographer in Saranac Lake, did a photography booklet with text, which is very rare and hard to get a hold of. And there was also, the New York State report of the commissioners that year had like a 20-some page, again, and included speeches and everything in there. So yeah, it was very, very well documented. It's a big deal.
And many of those historic newspapers you can access online. You can, if you have a New York Public Library card, you can access them, or please do ask your local librarians how to help you do that. They can help you manage all the intricacies of accessing them, but we are very fortunate that a lot of things have been digitized, and particularly historic newspapers. So I think our last question sort of disappeared. I think that we've answered them all. Before we start heading off for the evening, do any of you ladies have any final words? Alice, anything you would like to share?
As I said, I have an extensive database of the descendants. So if anyone is looking or needs help with it, I don't mind helping. And I love to hear from people.
Thank you. Any last words, Sandra?
Yes, so as you said, I didn't talk much about it, but I am putting the final touches on a book about the John Brown farm from the beginning up until today. And I thought I knew everything about the farm. Believe me, there is so much to know about it. It is such an amazing place that so many people have visited. So many people have made wonderful speeches there. It is a very, very rich place. And I feel very fortunate to live near it and to be able to visit it.
Thank you. Margaret, any last words?
Well, I feel the same way about the farm. I feel really fortunate to be within proximity so that I can visit it. And I'm a Californian, and when I moved here, actually even before I moved here, the first time I visited the Adirondacks, one of the first things I did was go to John Brown's farm. And when we moved here to New York, the first thing I did was take my two little kids to see John Brown's farm so that they could get indoctrinated very early. But I think he is a very important historical figure for the nation, not specifically for African Americans, but for what the nation claims that it is supposed to represent. And in the book that I'm working on now, I've got a chapter, so it's a chapter on Black women, but he's very important to it because the theme of the book, for want of a better term, is anti-racism, but it's about women and anti-racism. And it's about anti-racism among radical women, because radical women, white women, were sometimes quite racist. And so that's how we got to the point where Anthony and Stanton were calling Black people the N-word at conferences. So, but that's not the whole story. And it's that backstory that I am looking at. And John Brown is very much a part of that. So I think this is a very important moment. And let's just keep John Brown's farm alive. John Brown should continue to live.
Yes, yes.
As we go forward celebrating this wonderful 125th anniversary, there are a number of upcoming events that we do want to be sure that you are aware of. Tomorrow, May 9th, is John Brown's actual birthday, and there will be an informal gathering at the farm at 2 p.m. And so we do invite anyone who is available to please join us there. On May 19th, there will be a virtual book talk with Jefferson Hall, author of A Prison in the Woods, Environment and Incarceration in New York's North Country. On June 18th, installation of the memorial field for Black Lives at the farm will return, a very moving event and section last year. And I look forward to being able to contemplate that even with the additional deaths following George Floyd's unfortunate ending. On July 17th, there will be a commemoration of the July 1896 event, celebrating New York State taking over the farm as a state museum, and please do add that to your calendar. And on June 19th, there will be music and storytelling at John Brown Farm. So I again want to thank John Brown Lives, New York State Parks, and everyone involved in keeping this very important couple, both John and Mary Brown, in the public awareness. Thank you, ladies, for your lovely words, and thank you all for joining us, and we bid you a good evening.
Thank you, Lovatta.